Now to our interview with the guest of the day. I am joined by the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise, Dr. Muda Yusuf, for discussion on the decision of the federal government to halt subsidy removal and target non-oil revenue. Dr. Yusuf is also the former Director General of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Jimmy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, it was just about 2 weeks ago when we had fuel subsidy was one of the 3 major issues we discussed on this program, where you enumerated the challenges ahead of the incoming administration. But it appears the more we talk about fuel subsidy removal, the less we do. What makes it more delicate or so delicate to deal with?
Well, by its very nature and the fact that it has far-reaching implications, especially for the ordinary Nigerians. Also, when you situate it within the context of the prevailing poverty conditions and the sensibility of Nigerians generally, it makes the issue of fuel subsidy a very touchy one. It makes it an emotive matter, even though there are very sound economic arguments to support it, to ensure economic sustainability. But again, one needs to be sensitive, to these other issues, the social dimension of the issues, and also the political dimension. Because tough decisions often come with high political costs, most times. Although, as they say, leadership is not about popular decisions. Leadership is not a popularity contest. It's just like if somebody has an ailment and you want to be healed, you need therapy. The process of therapy is not often a very pleasant one. But at the end of the day, the patient smiles if it gets healed eventually. So that is what it is. So because of the nature of it, it requires very wide consultation. It requires consensus building. And sometimes it is difficult to build, some of those consensus. And again, over time, we have not actually put in place some key enablers, that will ensure that we get this subsidy thing behind us. That is one. Secondly, there are also issues of trust deficit. If the citizens feel that those calling on them to make sacrifices are not demonstrating the spirit of sacrifice, they feel that, why must we sacrifice when those our leaders are not showing example? So for a whole lot of reasons, it has been a very difficult issue to deal with. But gradually, I think we are building some consensus around it, especially because now the economy is in dire straits. The economy is, we're almost in a state of insolvency. What insolvency means is your ability to easily meet your obligations. Because if you look at the data, even the recent data from the World Bank is saying that almost 90% of our revenue will go into debt service. I know the kind of pressure that is bringing on economic management as a whole. Apart from that, there is also the challenge of, you have to sustain the economy. Otherwise, you keep going around in circle. You have seen some of the recent ratings by international rating agencies. The ratings that they have given Nigeria is not very pleasant at all. We have been classified as very high risk, credit risk economy. And the implication of that is that if you want to raise capital now, either as a sovereign, as a country, or as a corporate, internationally, it's going to be extremely difficult. And if you are going to even get the capital at all, it's going to be very, very expensive, because they are going to factor in what we call risk premium, because you have been classified or categorized as a highly risky country, at least from the point of view of credit rating. These things are not, these are not good indications. They are not good signs for any economy. So, and we have a challenge, especially now that we are transiting into a new administration. There's a very big challenge to put the economy on a very strong footing. And some, difficult decisions will have to be made. Because at the end of the day, if you don't do those things, if you don't take those decisions. The economy may, I don't want to use the word collapse, but things may get really very bad.
All right, now that a decision has been made, how do you think it will affect the economy?
Now, let me make this point before we go ahead. I've heard people say that the government has decided to suspend the subsidy removal. I listened to the statement by the finance minister. She didn't quite say that government was suspending subsidy removal. What she said was that subsidy removal will not take place before the transition.
Absolutely.
It's going to be after the transition. And after the transition, the new government will now decide whether it wants to remove it or not, whether it wants to reschedule, whether it wants to face it. In other words, the new government will come with a framework for the removal, including the necessary engagements, including the necessary, policies to cushion the likely effects of the removal. Because for one thing, there is a legislative angle to the issue of subsidy now. Because the Petroleum Industry Act, as amended, allowed for subsidy only up till June. So the PIA is an act of the National Assembly. So it's a law. So nobody can unilaterally now sit down and say that I'm suspending the subsidy outside what has been agreed. The second legislative issue is what the minister also said, is that the decision to move it up till the removal up till June was backed by a supplementary budget. So for anybody to shift it beyond that, there has to be a supplementary budget, which has to be submitted to the National Assembly and approved. So these are some critical legislative issues that needs to be dealt with. So it is not possible for either the National Economic Council or the Minister of Finance to just announce that it has been suspended. And in any case, that was not what she said. What she said was that the removal will take place after the transition, and the new government will determine the modalities and the framework and the strategies for removal of the subsidy. So I think we need to make that very clear. Now, you are talking about the impact on the ordinary.
How does it affect the economy?
Now, the subsidy issue has a number of effects on the economy. Some positive, some negative. First is the revenue effect. Now we are spending, our estimate now is about 7 trillion naira annually. Because half year we are talking about 3.5 or 3.7 trillion. So if by the removal of the subsidy, we're able to make that savings, and if these resources are utilized properly, and don't forget, this savings is not only savings that will go to the purse of the federal government. It's a savings that will allow more revenues to accrue to the federation account. And when you have more revenues in the federation account, it benefits all tiers of government: the federal, the states, and the local governments. And we all know the financial condition of many of these state governments and local governments. Many of them are struggling to even pay salaries. Even as we speak, many of them are owing arrears of salaries. Many of them have not been able to pay even the minimum wage. They are struggling with the provision of facilities for their citizens. Provision of water, provision of rural roads, provision of health facilities, provisions of education, and all of that. And these are very crucial things that a government needs to provide to ease the burden on the citizens and to even, mitigate the current level of poverty. But the governments, they need these resources. So we have to make a choice. Do you want to use these resources to continue to provide the subsidy? Or you want to make it available to all tiers of government to be able to provide better service to the citizens? That is very important. Secondly, there's an investment effect. Because when we talk about subsidy removal, people think immediately about the fact that oil price is going to, fuel price will go up, blah, blah, blah. But more importantly, is the implication for investment. Because no economy thrives without investment. It is investment that drives the growth of any economy. It is investment that will lead to job creation. It is job creation that will lead to lasting reduction in poverty. So we need to recognize that nexus. Now, we have a very strategic sector, which ordinarily should be a very big asset to this country. I'm talking of the oil and gas sector. Unfortunately, and very unfortunately, it has become a liability to the country. And why did that happen? It has happened because the policy issues around the sector is not encouraging, it's not attracting investors into the sector. And when I mean investors, I mean private investors, both domestic and foreign investors. All the major players in the oil and gas sectors, many of them have divested. And for a very long time, many of them were not operating even in the downstream sector. Downstream is where you have refineries, pipelines, marketing, and so on. They have since left that space. And how do you have such a strategic sector and you are not able to pull investors into that space?
All right, Dr.
And look at how much money other countries are making from oil and gas investments.
Dr. Yusuf, before we get into these core issues,
yes.
Now you've talked about trust deficits, poverty, the good and bad connected to this issue.
Yes.
Over 100 million Nigerians living in poverty. How does an average Nigerian internalize this issue?
Well, that is why we need to engage properly. And that is why we need to play down on sentiments and emotions. Because we are looking at something that will ensure an enduring improvement in the lives of the average citizens. When people talk about prices will go up, and of course I resonate with that. I agree with them. But we need to think medium term. We need to think long term. We are where we are today, where we are spending close to $15 billion to be importing petroleum products into the country, just because of the dysfunctional policies in the oil and gas sector. That is not a good story to tell. What are we going to tell incoming generations? That you had this massive natural resource that other countries are using to build fantastic economies, to build their infrastructure, to build their industries, and yet you don't have anything to show for it. So we need to ensure that we enlighten the citizens to know that this is for this is in the best interest of not only the current generation, but also future generation. And I talked about the impact additional revenue will have. There are also the employment effects. If we're able to unlock investment in this sector, we should be looking at annually close to $5 billion to $10 billion US dollars of investment in that space. And when you have investment, you have economic growth. When you have economic growth, everybody benefits. Of course, the government has to ensure that we have a growth that is inclusive. Because you could have a growth that is not inclusive. And the whole essence of an inclusive growth is to ensure that everybody benefits.
All right.
From the process of the growth. So there's a whole lot that can happen. We are going to have savings. Our foreign reserve is going to improve significantly. Because imagine you are not spending $15 billion annually to be importing petroleum products. Imagine the impact of that on our foreign reserves. Imagine the impact of that on our exchange rate.
All right, so ultimately, fuel subsidy removal is good for us, but must be faced, isn't it?
Of course, it is very good. But we need to convince people, and we need to be able to also deliver the message properly. And we also need to appeal to our elites. Because sometimes people, say things that sometimes could mislead the generality of the citizens. We cannot continue this way. We cannot continue.
All right.
We have 4 refineries. None have worked for close to 10 years. We can't continue this way. And the only way to make these things work is to decouple it from the government. Government cannot run it. That is the central message.
Private investors?
Yes. Private investors. Look at what is happening with Nigeria LNG. If Nigeria LNG was under NNPC, do you think they'll be thriving the way they are thriving? Look at the billions of dollars they are declaring as dividends to government. Government is a shareholder in it. So the government can be a shareholder in this, but the minority shareholder.
All right. So, Dr. Yusuf, a new administration is due in May, and many analysts are saying this decision is sort of a trap for the incoming administration.
No, that is not correct. Even the incoming administration had laid it out clearly in its manifesto that subsidy will be removed. The details and the framework for the removal, of course, was not stated in the manifesto. That's not a manifesto issue. But it is a cardinal point of the incoming administration. It's clearly stated in the manifesto. That is one. Secondly, right from the beginning of the year, it has been stated that that the subsidy provision that we have will be up until June 2023. Everybody knows that. And there was also an amendment to the Petroleum Industry Act. Because ideally, if the act was not amended, the removal of subsidy could have been effective from January. Because it's already a law. But it was amended so that we can push it forward to June. So the minister and the NEC have not said anything new. They have not said anything new. These are things that we already know. These are things that the incoming administration also already stated in its manifesto.
But government talks about wrong timing. When will the timing be ideal?
Well, that is debatable. Because there's no perfect timing for things like this. Decisions have to be taken. But it has to be taken strategically. And that is why when we talk about this issue of subsidy, we should not talk about it in isolation. We should be talking about enablers for the subsidy removal. One of the enablers is to ensure that we have competition in that space, starting even with the importation, because you can't fix the refineries overnight. What we are dealing with now is a monopoly situation. NNPC is the sole importer of petroleum products. That is why diesel is as expensive as it is. That is why aviation fuel is as expensive as it is. Because no matter what you say, once you have a monopoly situation, you have set up the people for exploitation. No matter how well-meaning the leadership may be. And the best way in economic management to protect the citizens is to ensure competition. Once there is competition, the opportunities for exploitation and ripping up of people will be drastically reduced. That is absent in the current framework. So the first thing that should happen under the new administration is to ensure that there's competition.
Okay.
Only NNPC cannot be importing petroleum products. We can have as many as 20 of them. If they all have access to foreign exchange at whatever rate it is, and they have access to imports, of course, subject to quality standards, we are not likely to see this kind of exploitation that is taking place. That is one. Secondly, we need to liberalize investment in refineries. Whatever it will take to incentivize investors in refineries, we have to put it on the table, and we have to be very generous about it. Because there are quite a number of people who are interested in investing in refineries. We have so many licenses that people have been carrying around. But they cannot activate investment because the policy is not conducive for the investment. You cannot take a private capital, invest in a project, and government will be dictating the price at which you sell your product. It's not done anywhere. Because this is not a social product. So we need to ensure that we create environment for more investors in refineries, private investors. And the current refineries we have needs to be privatized. It may not be completely. Government can still hold some minority share, but government should not be the one appointing MDs, dictating procurement. And if you continue with that model, there's no way we can get out of this crisis.
Right. Very valid points. Thank you, Dr. Yusuf. Now, let's quickly take a break, and when we come back, this discussion will continue. Please stay with us. Thank you very much for staying with us. This is still Politics Tonight, digging beyond the headlines. And on the program tonight, we're discussing the federal government's decision to halt subsidy removal and target non-oil revenue with Dr. Muda Yusuf, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise. So, Dr. Yusuf, now, the president-elect has promised to remove subsidy upon inauguration. Do you see him changing his mind?
No, you see, it is because we also need to be politically strategic. The president-elect is a very democratic person. He believes in consultation. And I believe that after going through all of that, it may not be strategic to, from day one, completely remove the subsidy. Okay. Because the shock on the citizens will be too much. That was why I was talking about enablers. We need to create soft landing, even for the citizens, because times are extremely hard. And we also need to situate this within the current political context. You know what the election was, all the issues and all of that. So, if you take all that into consideration, a matter like this requires very good consultation and stakeholder engagement. I'm not sure whether that has started to happen, but it is good for those things to precede whatever decision has to be taken. That is one. Secondly, because the oil price is still very high, still hovering between 80, 90, 100, it is much more difficult to remove everything at a go. If the oil price was around 50 or less, it will be much easier to deal with. But because it's at the level at which it is, it will be very difficult to remove everything. So I believe that first, there should be a strategy to do it in phases. Okay. And as we do that, we also put in place palliatives. Not palliatives in the sense of handing over money to people, but palliatives in terms of bringing down the cost of living. We have to examine the variables driving inflation. Which of those variables are quick wins that you can, deal with to bring down the cost of living? We need to engage those who are in agriculture. Already, the current government is doing a bit of that. But the incoming administration can do a lot more. What are the impediments to agricultural production? What are the impediments to mechanization? What are the impediments to the use of technology in agriculture? We are using tech everywhere, but we are not seeing much of tech in agriculture. Because if we see more of technology in agriculture, you see more younger generation. Because the energy of Nigeria today lies in the youths. And we can unleash it in agriculture if only we make the space more tech-driven. That is what is happening in many other parts of the world. So if you look at all the issues around agricultural production, agri-processing, I mean, we talk to those people who are producing staple foods. I've seen the Bakers Association come here to complain bitterly several times about the challenges they are facing with the cost of bread, particularly the inputs that they use in the production of bread. Bread is a staple food. What concessions can we give the players in that ecosystem to bring down the cost of bread? These are the things that the common people want to see.
All right. Dr. Yusuf, I'm sure you know organized labor has continued to discourage subsidy removal. So how do we achieve unanimity on this issue?
Well, we cannot have too much of consultation. And just as I said, we need to put enablers on the table. We don't just call labor and say that we are removing subsidy. What are we putting together to complement the removal of subsidy and to cushion the effects? And there must be timeline for these things. So that kind of engagement must happen. And labor must also realize that depending on a government-run refinery to provide petroleum product for this country is not sustainable. Because they kept saying that we should make refineries to work. The refineries, the way they are today, are big liabilities to the economy. They are drain pipes. Rather than being an asset, they are a big liability. I'm sure Labour doesn't want to saddle the new administration with a bundle of liabilities. And not just the administration, all of us as citizens.
Nigerians.
We don't want a platform which is just a patronage platform. We have spent how much for turnaround maintenance? Billions of dollars over the last 10 years. And yet these refineries have not worked. And yes, we are still insisting that unless they work, we cannot deal with this important reform. So I believe that Labour needs to have a rethink on that. We should have, just as I said, first, we should have a competitive framework, even under the current importation regime. Let there be competition. Let us liberalize the foreign exchange market so that you don't need to go and be begging anybody to get foreign exchange. You don't need to go and be queuing the CBN to get foreign exchange. Once you have your documents, you should be able to access the foreign exchange. Again, that will require reforming the foreign exchange market itself. That's another big issue that we need to deal with. So once you have competition in that space, the second phase is to ensure that we encourage more people to invest in refineries. You have to waive all the duties on equipment for those who are interested. Let us waive it. Waive all the taxes. Give them tax holidays. And we have to do more to encourage people to even move away from the use of petroleum products.
All right.
Let us use more gas for our generators. Let us use more gas for our vehicles. All these trucks and all, they can convert them to compress natural gas.
All right, Dr. Yusuf. Now, because President-elect Bola Tinubu has made it clear that improving the living conditions of Nigerians is one of his major priorities.
Yeah.
So what measures can be put in place, to ensure that the removal of fuel subsidy does not worsen inflation and economic instability?
Well, it's to look at what are the things that the common people consume. What are the things they spend their money on? Almost 70 to 80% is on food. Maybe another 30% is on transportation. Of course, you have other things that school fees and the rest of them. So let us look at what can bring down the cost of food. And we cannot do that without engaging those who are in agriculture. And we look at the entire agricultural value chain. What can we do about inputs into agriculture? What can we do about, production, farming, and all of that, mechanized agriculture? What can we do about processing? What can we do about storage of agriculture so that we don't have huge post-harvest losses? What can we do about irrigation so that we have all year-round farming rather than waiting for rainy season before we can farm? What can we do about packaging? What can we do about marketing? So it's a whole range of issues in that agri value chain. And it has the prospect of creating, apart from providing food, has the prospect of generating a whole lot of employment. That is one. On transportation, there has to be massive investments in mass transit in the immediate to short term. But long term, we need to see more rail services all over the world, especially where you have this kind of population. They use a lot of rail. Railway system works. It moves goods, it moves people across everywhere. That is the way it is in many other countries, especially where you have this kind of population. So you cannot overinvest in the transportation infrastructure. And again, in order to encourage investors, we can look at the tariffs. All these buses that are not produced locally, what is the import duty we are charging on them? We can slash them by 50% or scrap them completely. These are some quick wins that you can deploy. And of course, just as I said, we can do a lot more with renewables so that less people will be relying on this either generator or even the so-called national grid. It is very cheap for me to install solar on my roof. It's very cheap for me to buy the inverters and the batteries. Why will I worry about whether one disco is performing or the other?
All right.
So we can make those things more accessible through policy. And we should also need to deal with inflation. That's a macroeconomic issue. There's a supply side factor to inflation, but there's also a macroeconomic management side dimension to inflation. We have to reduce the rate at which the CBN is funding the deficit. Credit to government by the banking system as of February was about 28 trillion naira. Those things have significant effects for inflation. So when we talk about inflation, we are just talking about diesel and all of that. We are not talking about the monetary effect on liquidity, which is driving inflation. So we need to keep a tap on that. The CBN cannot just be throwing money into the system the way it has been throwing money. Those things have very serious inflationary effect.
All right. So, Dr. Yusuf, government spoke recently about $800 million facility if and when fuel subsidy is removed. Do you think this facility is necessary?
Well, first of all, the whole concept of subsidy removal is to make savings, among other things. Now, when you are making savings, why will you go and borrow again? We are talking that altogether, in a year, we are spending about 7 trillion naira. If we're able to make even half of that as gain, why will you need to go and borrow money to be able to provide palliatives? So I don't understand the logic.
So this is quite unnecessary.
I don't understand the logic. Now, we have had this subsidy thing in the past. We had the Petroleum Trust Fund. It was a product of subsidy removal at that time. And the funding of the Petroleum Trust Fund was from the savings from the removal of subsidy at that time. We had Shopee under Jonathan. The funding for Shopee was from the savings from the subsidy remover. So why must you go and borrow, especially now that our debt thing is overflowing? Why must you go and borrow again for that? I don't understand the logic. And in any case, whatever we are doing around palliatives should be managed by the incoming administration. Yes, maybe they have been able to secure the loan, but anything about disbursement, register, all these things they are talking about, all those should be put on hold. Let the incoming administration come with its own framework as to how to deal with this matter.
All right. So let's get practical now. Dr. Yusuf, do you think an average Nigerian can survive a situation where he or she has to buy petrol for as high as 800 naira a litre?
No, certainly not.
Okay.
Certainly not. And that is why I was talking about phased removal. Even right now, it may not have been pronounced as a policy. You don't buy petroleum products at the same price across the country.
Yeah, that's it.
Even in Lagos here, some are selling at 184, some are selling at 200, some are selling at 220, and the farther away from Lagos, the higher those prices. So already, the market mechanism is already creeping in, even before the formal announcement of this deregulation. But to come to your point, the shock will be too much. So that's why I was saying that this thing has to be faced. And as we are facing it, we need to complement it with things that will ease the burden on citizens, some of which I've mentioned earlier.
Absolutely.
So that is the way I think it should be handled.
All right, so let's talk about more angles to this particular issue. The National Economic Council has targeted $2.5 billion revenue from non-oil sector. How feasible is this?
$2.4 billion.
$2.5 billion.
Revenue.
Yes, from non-oil sector.
Well, I think it is feasible. I don't have the data right now. I think it's feasible because when you look at how much we are getting from oil, I mean, you're talking about maybe close to 40, 50 billion, annually. So we are talking about 2.5. I don't think that is much. Even diaspora remittances. Diaspora remittances for many years has been over 20 billion US dollars. So if we are talking about 2.5, I don't think that is too much to achieve. But more importantly, is to build the capacity of this economy to be more productive. To be more productive to ensure import substitution. So that most of the things we are importing, we will not be importing them again. So that will go a long way. And to also ensure productivity to be able to diversify the economy. We have more reserves in gas than in crude oil. Look at what all the countries that have gas, they are smiling now because of all this problem of Russia and Ukraine. And you have huge reserves of gas here. What are we doing to unlock the potentials for investment in that space? These are quick wins. These are things that can make us leapfrog easily. You know how many billions of dollars you make if you really create the environment for people to invest in gas? These are things that are available, hot demand all over the world. Even though we talk about decarbonization and all of that, but even many of these countries are beginning now to even recognize gas as a transition fuel.
So
there's a whole lot of potential. It is good to talk about non-oil, but we need to optimize opportunities even in the oil and gas area, which we are not doing enough of. There's a lot to be done in that space.
So talking about unlocking potentials, what measures do you think the next president should use to diversify the economy for increased revenue?
Well, there are quite a number of things. First, we are losing a lot of revenue from oil to oil theft. And unfortunately, that has been with us for some years. Lately, the current administration has woken up and has taken some steps. But even then, we are still struggling to meet our OPEC quota. That's a huge loss of revenue. It's a huge loss of foreign exchange. So how the political will to deal with that problem, that will help to unlock quite a lot of revenue. We have discussed the issue of subsidy. Even though it's a contentious issue, if we're able to progress with it, you should be able to unlock close to 7 trillion naira in revenue.
That's a lot of money.
Then we have another worrisome subsidy, which is foreign exchange subsidy. Now, annually, the central bank says between $20 to $22 billion in the official foreign exchange market. The official rate, at least according to what's on the CBN website, is about 461, 462. The market rate is over 700. So even if we take the $20 billion and take it to the market at 600, we'll be making close to 200 naira extra on a dollar. And if you look at that properly, you should be unlocking revenue of between 3 to 4 trillion naira from it. Because the economic players today are buying forex at, most of them, over 700. So the arbitrage between are being enjoyed by some people within the economy. That's a huge rent. That we have created a huge rent opportunity, which we need to do away with. And if we do away with that, we'll be locking revenue minimum of 3 trillion naira annually, minimum. Then, if you build the economy well, there is a strong correlation between economic growth and revenue growth. So if you deal with all the variables affecting investment, we are talking about macroeconomic environment, we are talking about inflation, we are talking about foreign exchange stability and credibility of the process, we are talking about insecurity, we are talking about the regulatory environment, we are talking about the challenges at the ports, we are talking about bureaucracy as they relate to government and to businesses. If we're able to remove those barriers, the economy will grow much better. There'll be more investment. If you have more investment in an economy, certainly revenue will grow with it. There's a strong correlation between revenue growth, investment growth, and GDP growth. So growth is also very important. Not just to generate revenue, but even to also create jobs. Then we need to reform our budget process.
All right.
Because the budget itself, a lot of issues we have heard about the budget. Budget padding, duplication of projects, all sorts of issues. So you have a process to do a proper audit of the budgetary process and to clean it up so that all these wastages will be stopped. Right, then we need to cut down the cost of governance. Because fiscal sustainability is not only about revenue. It's only about how are we managing costs. Those things have to go together to ensure the sustainability of the fiscal space.
All right. Sadly, we may not be able to unpack all of the angles connected to this discussion because of time. But then, before we go then, how can Nigeria attract foreign debts? How can Nigeria attract foreign direct investments to stimulate economic growth and reduce debt burden?
You see, when we talk about investment, foreign investment is as important as local investment.
Okay.
In fact, local investment are giving us more jobs than foreign investments. And what is good for the foreign investor is good for the local investors. So we have to deal with issues of investment environment generally. And that will entail some of the reforms that I've talked about. And one major obstacle to foreign investment today is our foreign exchange policy. And this must be one of the quick things that the new administration has to tackle. And happily, it's in the manifesto of the APC. The current foreign exchange policy cannot continue if you want to make progress in this economy. You cannot have an economy where some people are getting foreign exchange at 461, others are getting it at 740, 750. All right. An economy cannot progress that way. And investors will not come. So we need to remove policy barriers. We need to remove regulatory barriers. We need to deal with issues of insecurity and the perception that is creating for the economy and for the country. We need to inspire confidence in investors. Dr. Yusuf, and we need to ensure level playing field.
Dr. Yusuf, you would
for
agree
all
with
for,
me
for
that,
all investors.
This is a discussion that cannot be overemphasized, especially as a new government is set to be inaugurated.
Exactly,
but I must say a very big thank you to you, Dr. Muda Yusuf. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise. Thank you very much,
Thank
sir,
you,
for finding
Jumake.
time
Thank
to be
you.
on
It's a
the program.
pleasure. Thank you.